The music had only just begun to fade when the entire room shifted into panic. Guests pushed back from their seats, whispers rising like a wave as the heavy church doors slammed open so loudly that even the officiant staggered. Stella, the bride who had spent months planning every detail of this perfect day, froze mid-smile as everyone turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, clothes dirty, one cheek swollen, hair tangled as if she had been running for her life. Her hands trembled against her stomach, the curve of her pregnancy unmistakable as she stepped inside, gasping for air, eyes darting across the crowded room until they landed on the bride. For a moment, no one moved. It felt like someone had sucked all the oxygen from the ceremony. Then Stella marched forward, her heels snapping against the floor with a fury no one had ever seen in her. Before anyone could understand what was happening, Stella kicked the woman hard enough to send her stumbling to her knees, a sound of pain escaping her as guests screamed and the groom stood frozen, unable to take a single step toward either woman. The pregnant woman lifted her head slowly, breathing through the ache in her side, her voice raw yet steady as she looked up at the bride who towered over her. "Go ahead," she whispered, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Hit me again, Stella, because today, I'm exposing your darkest secret." Every person in the hall fell silent at once, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes the heart beat louder than the music that had just played moments earlier. The groom's face went pale, his fingers twitching at his side as though he already knew there was more coming, something he had feared but hoped would never surface. And as the camera of a guest's phone caught the bride stepping back in shock, everything seemed to freeze in place, the perfect wedding collapsing into chaos in less than a minute. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But how did this wedding turn into a battlefield? And what secret could destroy everything? In the seconds after Ruth's words echoed through the room, the story behind this shocking moment began long before anyone took their seats. Stella had always carried herself like someone born to be admired. People loved her elegance, the way she seemed to glide through any room as if she owned it, and she fed off that attention with a hunger that never quite faded. Behind the flawless hair and designer gown, though, lived a woman who feared being overlooked more than anything else. Every decision she made was about maintaining the image she worked so hard to build, and her wedding was meant to be the crown jewel of that image. She wanted cameras, influencers, magazine-worthy decor, and the assurance that everyone watching, both in person and online, would talk about her. It wasn't love she craved most, it was validation. And as she forced a smile during the engagement months earlier, she ignored the small signs that Michael hesitated when the conversation shifted too quickly from romance to spectacle, from commitment to presentation. Michael, in contrast, had always been the calm in every storm. A kind, steady entrepreneur known for helping people without asking for anything in return, he wasn't used to conflict. He was loyal almost to a fault, sometimes staying in situations long after they stopped feeling right, and his friends often wondered if he rushed into this wedding more out of duty than excitement. He cared for Stella, that much was clear, but there were moments, quiet ones, subtle ones, when he seemed lost in thought, as if he carried something heavy he wasn't ready to share. He didn't like how quickly everything escalated. The venue bookings, the expensive add-ons, the pressure from Stella to commit to a vision that felt more like a performance than a marriage. He tried to be supportive, as he always was, but a part of him questioned why he felt uneasy whenever he saw Stella checking her reflection instead of checking on him. And now, standing frozen in the ceremony, his eyes locked on Ruth, it was as if that uneasy feeling finally made sense. Ruth had once been warm, gentle, and hopeful, the kind of woman who found joy in small things. Morning coffee, handwritten notes, quiet evenings. But life had changed her in ways no one in that hall could have imagined. The exhaustion etched in her face, the cautious way she held her stomach, and the pain hidden behind her trembling voice all hinted at months of carrying a truth she feared no one would believe. She had known Michael once, not closely enough for gossip, but deeply enough for their paths to have mattered. Their connection had been simple, honest, built on mutual respect during a time when both needed someone who listened. But whatever existed between them ended long before the wedding was announced. And yet, something about Stella's rise to perfection, something about the speed of the engagement, something about the pressure surrounding this union had pulled Ruth into the middle of a story she never asked to be part of. She stood there now because silence had become too painful to carry. But none of the guests knew the storm that had already been building silently for months. Months before the wedding invitations were even printed, Michael had one of those moments that quietly change a person's path without warning. He had been leaving a small neighborhood grocery store when he noticed a woman sitting against the wall near the carts, her shoulders shaking as she struggled to catch her breath. At first, he thought she was simply tired, but when she tried to stand and nearly collapsed again, he rushed toward her without thinking twice. That woman was Ruth. She apologized over and over, embarrassed to be seen so vulnerable, but her voice cracked as she explained that she had barely eaten that day. When she placed a trembling hand over her belly, Michael realized she was pregnant. She told him her family had pushed her away, the father was gone, and she had nowhere else to go. Michael didn't hesitate. He bought her food, helped her sit inside his car so she could rest in the air conditioning, and drove her to a clinic after she admitted she'd been skipping appointments because she couldn't afford them. There was nothing romantic in that moment, just human compassion and a man who couldn't walk past someone in pain. As the weeks passed, he learned more about the heavy load Ruth had been carrying. She had lost her job shortly after discovering she was pregnant, and the man she planned to spend her life with disappeared the moment responsibility entered the picture. She tried to hold herself together, but stress had chipped away at her strength. One doctor quietly pulled Michael aside and mentioned that the strain on Ruth's mental and physical health could affect the baby if she didn't find stability soon. Ruth never asked for help. In fact, she often tried to refuse it, insisting she could figure things out on her own, but the exhaustion in her eyes told another story. Michael stepped in not because he wanted praise, but because doing nothing felt wrong. The more he understood her situation, the more he found himself thinking about how someone else might have walked past her at that grocery store without caring at all. And something about that possibility stayed with him. Michael continued helping her quietly, never once mentioning his involvement to anyone, not even Stella. He paid for some of her medical visits anonymously after the clinic confirmed she was struggling. He called a friend who owned a small bakery and arranged temporary work for her, nothing strenuous, simple packaging tasks so she could earn enough to cover daily needs. When Ruth tried to repay him, he gently reassured her that she didn't owe him anything. He even bought a few baby essentials and left them on her doorstep without signing his name, hoping she would feel supported without feeling ashamed. Ruth was grateful in a way that words rarely captured. She would text him simple updates. "Baby is okay today," or "I found a place to stay for a week. Thank you for helping me get back on my feet." But if Michael was only helping, why did Stella see Ruth as a threat? The answer started with a single message Stella found one night on Michael's phone from an unknown number. It was Ruth, thanking him. Stella had always liked to feel in control, but over the months leading to the wedding, a small seed of suspicion had taken root and grown into something she could no longer ignore. She noticed Michael disappearing at odd times, returning home distracted, often with his phone clutched a little too tightly. Every excuse he gave, late meetings, calls with clients, errands, felt like a lie to her mind, though nothing concrete existed. Stella began checking his phone when he wasn't around, scrolling through messages, noting patterns, reading tones, anything that could confirm the gnawing anxiety she refused to admit aloud. When she saw a few transactions labeled vaguely, along with texts from an unknown number thanking him, her mind leapt to conclusions she never spoke out loud. She followed him once, keeping to the shadows, until she saw him hand a small envelope of money to a woman she didn't recognize. In that moment, all her insecurities collided with jealousy, convincing her that the man she loved was betraying her. Michael, of course, saw nothing romantic in what he was doing. Ruth had begged him repeatedly not to involve anyone else, to keep their connection private, and he honored that request, believing it was the right thing for her safety and peace of mind. He could have tried to explain to Stella, tried to show her the truth, but he knew how quickly her mind could twist even the smallest gesture into evidence of betrayal. When Stella confronted him, her voice trembling with anger and fear, she threatened to end the relationship unless he cut all contact with Ruth immediately. Michael refused. his hands steady but his heart heavy. He couldn't abandon someone who had no one else to turn to, no matter the cost to his own comfort. Every refusal, every quiet act of compassion, planted seeds of rage in Stella's mind, though she would never admit it aloud. She had grown obsessive, and in her obsession, she took action she would later regret. Unable to rest on assumptions alone, Stella hired a private investigator to follow Michael, hoping to find proof of the affair she imagined. Weeks passed, reports arrived, and each one fed her growing certainty. She didn't know the real story, the truth behind Michael's quiet generosity, the medical visits he had arranged, or the baby clothes he had left anonymously on doorsteps. The investigator, unaware of the full picture, reported only what could be seen. Michael meeting a woman in public, handing her items, receiving heartfelt thanks in return. Stella saw confirmation of the narrative she had already written in her mind, a narrative that would soon collide violently with reality. And what the investigator discovered would ignite the explosion that led to the wedding disaster. The private investigator's report arrived on a crisp Thursday morning, and Stella devoured it with the intensity of someone hunting confirmation for the fears already consuming her. The photos were selective, angles chosen that captured Michael and Ruth in ways that looked intimate, their hands meeting briefly as he handed over money, smiles caught mid-motion that could be misinterpreted. The captions noted that Ruth was visibly pregnant, that Michael had been visiting her repeatedly, and that they seemed unusually close. But the investigator had no context, no understanding of why he was helping, no insight into the countless medical appointments he had arranged or the anonymous gifts he had left on her doorstep. It was enough to convince Stella that her worst fears were true, and her mind raced with every imagined betrayal, each one feeding a fire that would soon consume her judgment entirely. Rage replaced her anxiety, betrayal replaced her love. Every memory of his absences, every unanswered question, suddenly made sense in her eyes. By the time the wedding day arrived, Stella had made her choice. She would marry Michael as planned. Nothing, she thought, would stop her from keeping appearances, but underneath the perfectly styled gowns and sparkling jewelry, she carried a vow that would shadow every moment of the ceremony: revenge. Ruth, the woman who had disrupted the image she had worked so hard to craft, was now her target. Stella imagined humiliating her, exposing her in front of the guests, and teaching her a lesson she would never forget. Every detail of the wedding, every flash of cameras, every guest who whispered about elegance or style, became part of Stella's plan. But the most critical part of the story, the truth of Michael's intentions, the real reason he had been helping Ruth all along, was absent from every report, every photo, every obsessive thought. And yet, that missing piece, the truth that could have stopped everything, would remain invisible until the moment the chaos erupted. But the investigator missed the most important truth of all. Ruth sat alone in the tiny apartment she had been given temporarily, the city noise filtering in through the cracked window, and her thoughts turned inward, circling a truth she had kept hidden from nearly everyone. Her unborn child, the life growing quietly inside her, carried a medical condition so severe that even the most skilled doctors had warned of the dangers if treatment wasn't started immediately. She had felt the panic rise the moment the diagnosis landed in her hands, the helplessness of knowing there was a chance she could lose the baby weighing on her like a storm cloud. Michael, the one man who had no reason to intervene, had quietly stepped in, paying for consultations, procedures, and medications she could never have afforded on her own. When he had handed her the first envelope of money, she had broken down, asking him why he would do this for someone he barely knew, and he had looked at her calmly and said, "Promise me you won't tell anyone. Some people don't understand helping someone in need." And Ruth had nodded, knowing immediately that if Stella found out, she would see it as weakness, as a challenge to her control, and Michael could be in danger. Every day that followed, Ruth carried the weight of both gratitude and fear. She texted Michael brief updates, keeping their communication strictly about the baby and her health. When she saw him around town, she avoided eye contact, fearing that even a smile would draw attention. She couldn't risk Stella's wrath, couldn't risk her own life being dragged into a confrontation that would harm the one person who had been kind without expectation. And yet, even as she obeyed Michael's request and hid the truth, Another layer of secrecy began to form in her mind. There were things she had kept from him as well. Things she didn't even know how to explain. Fears she could barely face herself. Because Ruth was keeping one more secret. One even Michael didn't know. Ruth opened the envelope slowly, her hands trembling, unaware of the weight the single sheet of paper would carry. Inside was a letter from the hospital, crisp and official-looking, explaining in cold, bureaucratic language that the surgery her unborn child desperately needed had been canceled. Shock pinned her in place as she read the lines over and over, refusing to believe what her eyes told her. The hospital claimed someone had intervened, someone had insisted they halt the procedure, and payment had been made to ensure Ruth could receive no care at that time. Her stomach twisted, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She looked to the bottom of the page, her eyes widening as the signature came into focus. Stella Kingsley. The name burned across the paper like a brand, a revelation that made everything click. The suspicious glances, the threats, the jealousy, the obsession over Michael. Stella hadn't just imagined betrayal. She had taken action long before the wedding, sabotaging Ruth in the most personal, dangerous way possible. The shock left Ruth reeling, a mix of fear and anger coursing through her. She had hidden the truth for so long, protected Michael, obeyed his request, and now realized the enemy had been closer than she could have imagined. Stella had not only been controlling the narrative of her own life, but actively attempting to destroy Ruth's chance at survival and happiness. Every earlier act of jealousy, every secretive glance Michael had tried to explain, every ounce of rage Stella had felt suddenly made horrifying sense. Ruth realized that the chaos she would face at the wedding wasn't spontaneous. It had been orchestrated, premeditated, and personal. She folded the letter slowly, her mind racing with questions and plans. And for the audience following this story, if you're still watching to this point, drop "I'm still here" in the comments. We want to see our loyal viewers. Because from this moment on, nothing would be the same, and the storm waiting for the wedding day was about to explode. Weeks before the wedding, Stella's obsession escalated from suspicion to active sabotage, revealing a ruthlessness few could have imagined. One evening, Ruth was leaving a convenience store when she noticed a sleek black SUV idling nearby. Before she could react, Stella stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The smile she wore didn't reach her eyes. They were cold, calculating. Stella cornered Ruth, leaning in close, and with a voice as calm as it was threatening, said, "Leave Michael alone, or I'll make your life a nightmare." Ruth froze, barely able to respond, realizing that her attempts to stay invisible had failed. In the following days, Stella took deliberate action to control Ruth's life, bribing her landlord to threaten eviction, sending anonymous messages insisting she disappear, and even calling the hospital, instructing doctors to demand upfront payment before offering any care. Every step was a calculated move designed to strip Ruth of stability, hope, and safety, forcing her further into isolation while Stella polished her own image for the wedding. The pressure became unbearable. Ruth, already exhausted and carrying the weight of her unborn child's condition, began to feel as though the walls of her world were closing in. Desperation and hopelessness consumed her, and in a moment of utter despair, she attempted to take her own life. She left a note, brief but heart-wrenching, and retreated from the world, believing that no one could save her from the relentless storm Stella had orchestrated. Michael, unaware of the extent of Stella's cruelty, happened to check on her that evening, noticing something was wrong just in time. Acting quickly, he intervened, providing care and calling emergency services, saving her life once again. Yet Ruth remained silent, protecting Michael from the truth and hiding the full scope of Stella's actions, knowing that revealing everything could endanger both her and him. But despite it all, Ruth kept silent until she learned the truth that changed everything. As the wedding day approached, Ruth uncovered a truth so devastating it threatened to crush everything she thought she knew. Through a series of documents and whispered confessions, she learned the identity of her unborn child's father, the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. Her heart sank, every memory of his absence and broken promises suddenly layered with a new, bitter clarity. The shock intensified when she realized the connection she had never imagined. He was Stella's ex-boyfriend, someone whose past Stella had carefully buried beneath layers of wealth, influence, and control. Stella had known all along. She had orchestrated Ruth's suffering not out of jealousy over Michael, not because of concern for herself, but to protect her carefully constructed image, to ensure her wedding remained perfect, untainted, and free from the inconvenient complication of a child linked to her history. Every cruel act, every bribe, every barrier she had put in Ruth's path suddenly made sense, a plan to erase the problem completely. Staring at the pieces of evidence in disbelief, Ruth felt the weight of Stella's calculated malice settle in her chest like stone. She understood now that Stella's obsession had never been about love or rivalry with her, but about control and erasure. Every moment of suffering, every threat, every attempt to isolate her was part of a deliberate effort to destroy a life that reminded Stella of a past she refused to confront. And in that moment, Ruth made a choice. She would no longer hide. She would face Stella, not with vengeance or anger, but with the truth that had been buried beneath months of manipulation and cruelty. Everything would come to light, no matter the consequences. And that is why Ruth walked into the wedding, not for revenge, but for the truth. Ruth stood in the center of the opulent wedding hall, her chest rising and falling as she drew strength from a resolve that had carried her through months of fear and betrayal. Guests stared, frozen, as the woman who had once been invisible now commanded every eye in the room. Stella stepped forward, her face twisted in fury, attempting to silence her with words sharp and threatening, but Ruth didn't flinch. Michael, finally seeing the tension in its entirety, pushed past the confusion and demanded the truth, his voice trembling not with anger, but with a desperate need to understand the chaos that had upended their lives. Slowly, Ruth spoke, her voice steady at first, then breaking under the weight of all she had endured. The hospital that had refused her care, the landlord bribed to evict her, the anonymous threats that haunted her days, the manipulated private investigator's report, and the photos selectively presented to frame her as a threat. Every revelation landed like thunder in the stunned hall. As the words sank in, Michael's face paled, the realization dawning that Stella had orchestrated everything. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate campaign to destroy Ruth and the life she carried. He reached for her hand, steadying her trembling body, while tears streamed down Ruth's cheeks. "She didn't want me gone," Ruth whispered, her voice breaking, echoing across the room. "She wanted my baby gone." The hall fell silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in gasps and murmurs as the truth crystallized for everyone present. Guests who had admired Stella's perfection recoiled, whispers of shock spreading like wildfire. The weight of betrayal, the depth of her cruelty, and the sheer audacity of her actions left everyone in disbelief. Stella, once in control of every gaze and every thought in the room, now stood isolated, her power stripped away by the very truth she had tried to bury. The hall erupted into chaos as Stella's carefully constructed facade crumbled before the eyes of every guest. She screamed, her voice sharp and raw, denying accusations, pointing fingers at anyone who would listen, trying to deflect the weight of her actions. But the evidence Ruth had revealed was undeniable, and cracks in Stella's defenses widened with every passing second. Finally, through tears and ragged breaths, she admitted fragments of the truth, the manipulations, the bribes, the threats, but not enough to regain control or sympathy. Guests whispered among themselves, their admiration replaced by shock and judgment. Bridesmaids turned away, their dresses glittering in the hall's lighting, leaving Stella to face the consequences alone. Michael, heart heavy and resolute, removed his wedding ring, a silent symbol of both betrayal and liberation, signaling that nothing would continue under the shadow of lies. Stella's parents, shocked and ashamed, publicly disowned her, their voices cutting through the murmurs of the crowd with finality. In the midst of the collapse, Michael turned toward Ruth, his gaze filled with concern, relief, and unwavering support. Without hesitation, he canceled the wedding, knowing that no celebration could exist while truth and betrayal lingered like poison. He guided Ruth to a safe place, away from cameras, whispers, and the chaos that had consumed the hall, promising a moment of peace for both of them and the child she carried. Yet even as the dust settled and the stunned guests began to leave, A question lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. But would Stella let the truth destroy her, or destroy everyone else instead? The chaos hadn't yet fully subsided when Stella attempted to flee, her heels clattering against the marble floor as she pushed past shocked guests, desperate to escape the consequences of her actions. But the law had already caught up with her. Police arrived swiftly, guided by Ruth's meticulously collected evidence, records of hospital interference, bribed landlords, and threats. Every piece of proof painted a clear picture of deliberate harassment and medical sabotage. Stella's protests fell on deaf ears as she was led away in handcuffs, the weight of her manipulations finally colliding with reality. In that moment, the hall that had once glittered with anticipation and elegance became a testament to truth prevailing over deceit, a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, could outrun the consequences of their own cruelty. With Stella removed from the picture, Ruth finally found the space to breathe. Thanks to Michael's unwavering support, she underwent the surgery her baby desperately needed, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself a moment of hope. The baby survived. Ruth felt a profound sense of safety and dignity, not because of the money or favors, but because someone had stood by her when it truly mattered. Michael, having proven his loyalty and compassion, chose to walk away from the toxic entanglements of Stella's world, leaving Ruth to heal without interference. She thanked him quietly, her gratitude heavy with emotion, recognizing that true support often transcends material help. And as the story closes, we are left with this reflection. Some secrets are hidden out of shame, others out of fear, but the darkest ones are buried by those who fear the truth most. So, what would you have done if you were Ruth? Do you think Stella deserved her outcome? And should Michael remain in Ruth's life, or walk away entirely? If this story hit you like it hit us, tap that like button. It helps the channel so much. And subscribe if you want more gripping stories just like this.